Welcome, everyone. Great to see you here. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Thanks so much for joining us. Maybe note in the chat too if you've attended one or both of the previous lectures. Just curious. Cool. Thanks for responding in the chat. Well, we have people from all over. And we have a lot of repeat attendees. Thanks so much for joining us. So I think we'll get started. Welcome back to those who've been at previous lectures, and welcome to everyone who might be new as well. My name is Andrea Nandoskar. I'm the Education Program Manager at Historic Hawai Foundation. And yes, you are joining us today for the 30th Annual Experts Historic Preservation Lecture Series. The series is curated and co-sponsored by the UH School of Architecture's Historic Preservation Graduate Certificate Program and Historic Hawai Foundation. This year's theme is Conserving Architecture, and today's presenter will describe preservation efforts at two historic Maui churches, Wananalua Church in Hana and Kaʻahumanu Church in Wailuku. A note that all the lectures are being recorded. The first two lectures are up on the event webpage and the HHF YouTube channel, and today's lecture will follow in the next few days. If you do have questions as we go along, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll address as many as we can with our presenter at the end of the lecture. If you can take a moment to complete a short survey at the end when you log off, that would be greatly appreciated. For those, or for anyone who's new to Historic Hawai Foundation, we're a statewide nonprofit. We help people save historic places. These are sites that tell the stories of multi-layered history of Hawaii. We do it through education, advocacy, assistance, and protection of and for historic places. I'd now like to welcome our series partner, Dr. William Chapman, Dean of the School of Architecture, University of Hawaii at Manoa, who will introduce today's presenter. Please enjoy the lecture. Dr. Chapman.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Aloha, mai kako. It's so good to be back with this series. As I've said at previous talks, that I ran it for like 25 years, and it's nice to be back. And of course, we all miss Ralph Cam, who did a wonderful job standing in, and we lost him too early in every way. And I'd also like to do a moment to recognize the loss of Sarah Richards. Many of you may have known Sarah, but she was very active in arts and preservation, and was best known most recently for being pushing through the restoration of the Hawaii Theater. So she'll be much missed as well. So as you know, the theme this year is architectural conservation. This is in part because the Historic Preservation Program moved over to architecture. So it's going to have a much more architectural focus, maybe, though we will still continue to cover things in the realm of what we call intangible culture and history and many, many things that aren't strictly architecture. But I'm hoping in the School of Architecture it will have some impact on the way architects think about their surroundings and where they think about their heritage. So well, Katie Stevens is a long-time friend, colleague, ally. We served together on the Hawaii Historic Places Review Board for a number of years. She was most recently our chair. I was chair once before, and now I'm the vice chair, which is a much better job, I think, because you carry much less weight. But she has been a major figure in preservation in Hawaii, and this has been a passion as well as a career for her for over 32 years, which is hard to believe because you would think maybe she began that in kindergarten, if that's true. But anyway, so she holds a graduate degree in Masters of Architecture from the University of Hawaii, and we are in fact reviving the Masters right now. I'm working on the report for that for accreditation, and she has a preservation certificate program, which she took during the time Bill Murtaugh, who began this program back in 1986, had started here and began the Experts at the Palace series as part of his portfolio. She also holds a Bachelor of Science in Architectural Engineering from the University of Colorado at Boulder. She presently is Associate Principal and Historical Architect at Architects Hawaii Limited. So, Katie, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for doing it. So we look forward to your talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bill. So first, thanks to Andrea and Historic Hawai Foundation and to Bill Chapman. I really enjoyed this lecture series over the past decades, although I do miss going to the old archives building, but I think the Zoom is nice too because people can really watch from all over the places. So aloha, everybody. So I've been fortunate to work on rehabilitation projects at a couple historic churches on Maui recently. So I wanted to share with you all, but first wanted to kind of back up a little bit and kind of provide a little bit of background and context to that. So on October 23rd, 1819, 17 missionaries left Boston on the brig Thaddeus with these instructions. You are to aim at nothing short of covering these islands with fruitful fields and pleasant dwellings, and schools and churches, of raising up the whole people to an elevated state of Christian civilization. After a perilous journey around Cape Horn, they arrived in the Sandwich Isles 163 days later, anchoring off Kailua in what we now call the Big Island of Hawaii. At the time of their arrival, King Kamehameha had just died, and his widow, Queen Kaʻahumanu, had rejected the traditional system of worship. The Christian newcomers gained the confidence of the royalty and were allowed to begin their work of evangelization and education. They began by building churches, the first of which were small, indigenous thatched structures, many of which were accidentally burned to the ground. But soon more permanent structures were established. The first Congregationists were followed by missionaries of other denominations, including Catholic, Anglican, Mormon, Lutheran, and Methodist. The village church quickly assumed the role of the center of the village society, a meeting house for the entire community, and where gathering, singing, eating, and praying continued to take place, and the Hawaiian Islands became dotted with houses of worship. Some churches clearly had the unmistakable influence of New England in their architectural style, and in fact, some of the early churches were built of wood that had been measured and cut by carpenters in Boston and then shipped to Hawaii. These buildings generally did not survive because they were not designed with the Hawaii climate in mind. Adaptations were made over time, and the New England architecture evolved into a Hawaii mission style, which incorporated a response to climate, topography, and available building materials utilizing lava rock, coral, and local wood, all of which were available even in the most isolated communities. These buildings stand in contrast to the decorative, sometimes grim cathedrals in Europe and modern megachurches in the US mainland. To the early church builders, the coral blocks seemed comparable to the stone and brick used in New England. Although plentiful, the coral was hard to obtain, requiring teams of Hawaiians to go out on the reefs with crowbars and find suitable material. When Queen Kaʻahumanu converted to Christianity, she commissioned the construction of Kaʻahumanu Church in Honolulu. It was built with approximately 14,000 huge coral blocks, each of which was hand-cut underwater and weighed about half a ton. The coral reefs were also used as a source of lime for the creation of plaster. Wood came from shipwrecks or was hauled down from the mountains. Often the church construction projects were supervised by the missionaries themselves, and construction skills were a strong factor in their selection for posting by their superiors. For example, Father Damien de Vooster, who was canonized in 2009 for his efforts on behalf of the leprosy victims of Molokai, was originally assigned to church building as he was a skilled carpenter. He built 6 churches on Molokai during the late 1800s, 3 of which still stand today. The early Christians often believed that no place of worship was complete without a bell, which led to a long and expensive project of casting the bell in New England and having it shipped around Cape Horn to Hawaii. Months or even a year often lapsed between order and delivery. The churches also typically had an adjacent cemetery, which often contained the remains of non-Christians, as the cemeteries were often the only ones in the area. We see that as a major port for the kingdom, Lahaina served as an important base for missionary activity. In 1823, Kalaniʻimoku offered the recently arrived missionaries a site for a new church. In the village, and within 3 months of landing, a meeting house of frail material was erected. In 1828, they laid the cornerstone of a new building, the first stone meeting house constructed in Hawaii. Called Waine'e, it was described as a new, commodious, and durable, 104 feet by 50 with good galleries. The expense was nearly all defrayed by the chiefs. This building is no longer extant. Wailuku became the second major mission on the island. These two mother churches, as well as the one at Hana, spawned dozens of outstations throughout Maui, many of which are still in use. So in reviewing the history of the arrival of the missionaries in Christianity Hawaii, and then studying the historic churches on Hawaii and on Maui to sort of get some background for this myself, I was really amazed by the vast number of historic churches that exist in our islands. So I'd like to just mention a few of these on Maui that have sort of similar histories, issues, and challenges to the two Maui historic churches that we worked on recently. So Kaulana Pueo Church in Huelo. This church was built in the New England square and spare style in 1853. The land use had been the site of a dense grove of hala, a plant prized by coastal Hawaiians because its leaves made excellent canoe sails. The name Kalania Pueo, which literally means famous for owls, was built when the town of Huelo was a thriving sugar town with a mill and surrounding cane fields. The church is made of coral blocks that were hauled one block at a time from a depth of 2 or 3 fathoms from Waipio Bay, passed hand by hand through a line of hundreds of people to bring the pieces to the construction site. The interior is described as a plain, bare-walled sanctuary designed to ensure there would be no earthly distractions from the main events of redemption and salvation. The belfry houses a bell cast in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which was brought to the church in 1862. The surrounding community has seen many changes, transitioning from sugar and pineapple growing to the cattle farming and to current day with small farms and homes ranging from small and rural to large and extravagant. So Huialoha Church is in the town of Kaupo. This church was hand-built in 1859 by Christian missionaries and native Hawaiian converts over a 10-year period and completed in 1859 on the wind-whipped coastline of Mokulau Peninsula. The rocks were mortared together using local coral, and logs were brought down from Haleakala's wooded upper slopes to construct the roof, window frames, and doors. Once boasting more than 200 church members, the church has endured storms, earthquakes, and a dwindling congregation. During the mid-1970s, community efforts to restore the modest little church to its former glory unearthed an unexpected treasure within its walls, a bottle stuffed with handwritten notes, some scrawled in Hawaiian, dated February 9, 1942, a mere 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The note spoke of war and the hope for peace, with one message in particular lamenting that, with the men away, the women have done most of the work. A community effort to benefit concerts featuring Hawaiian entertainers such as the Sons of Hawaii, Chinoa Keawe, Lena Alahaini, and the Beamer Brothers was held in 1975 to raise funds for repairs. Originally known as St. Gabriel's, this church was built in 1860. It is one of the first stops on Maui for circuit-riding Roman Catholic priests. It is known as the Coral Miracle Church for the following reason. When church construction began, the parishioners experienced great difficulty in hauling the huge blocks of coral from the deep water just off the coast. Successful completion was in doubt until a huge storm battered the coast, and the next day the villagers found that substantial quantities of coral, enough to complete the church, had been washed ashore. When they were finished, the remaining coral was washed out to sea by another storm. The original structure was replaced in 1937 by a larger church nearby, and for a while, this church served as a warehouse. In 1951, it was rededicated and named Our Lady of Fatima. So the Palapala Ho'omau Church, which is in Kipahulu, was built in 1862. It's built of plastered fieldstone and walls over 2 feet thick. thick, and it was completed in 1862. There's currently a stained glass window that depicts Christ dressed in yellow and feather cape, favored by Hawaiian royalty, although I think this is a more recent addition. Adjacent to this church is a cemetery that holds the grave of Charles Lindbergh. The church was abandoned after many people began to move out of the community in order to seek employment on the sugar plantations, but it was eventually restored in 1965. The Kaʻahumanu Congregational Church is on the taro-growing peninsula of Kaʻahumanu on Maui's Hana coast. The early Congregationalists began building this thick-walled lava and coral block church in 1857, completing it 6 years later. At that time, people walked or rode horseback for miles to attend the church. To construct it, men formed a line to pass rocks and coral from the seashore to the church site. The coral was melted in an imu, which is an underground oven, and used to create the mortar and plaster. The imu can still be seen adjacent to the entrance to the church. Timber needed to build the roof came from the mountains a few miles away from Kaʻahumanu. The beams were cut and carried to Kaʻahumanu by 7 or 8 men at a time. They would carry it a short distance before another group of men would take over. The church was the only building in the area to survive a tsunami in 1946. By 1960, the congregation had dwindled to only a handful of people. The church was recently, in 1921 to 23, closed due to storm damage, but repairs have since been made to the roof, the interior, and the electrical and the flooring. This is the Holy Ghost Roman Catholic Church in Wailuku. So beginning in 1879, thousands of Portuguese Catholics immigrated to Maui from the Azores and Madeira Islands for jobs as contract laborers for the sugar plantation. Along with their families, they brought with them their devotion to the Catholic Church, the Holy Ghost, and their traditions surrounding the crown of Queen Elizabeth of Portugal. Completing their contracts, many moved to the Kula area as independent ranchers or farmers. This church was designed by Father James Bissell and built by his parishioners who were Portuguese and who would come to work on the local sugarcane plantation. His inspiration may have come from either the shape of Queen Elizabeth's crown, the design of Charlemagne's chapel, which he had seen at home in Austria, or similar chapels on the coast of Portugal. The first Mass was celebrated in 1895. The church decorated altar and the 14 Portuguese language stations of the cross were commissioned by the father in 1895 and were carved by the famous artisan and master woodcarver Ferdinand Stuflesser from Austria. It was shipped in 9 separate crates around the Cape of Good Hope to Hawaii, and the altar and stations were hauled by ox cart from Kahului Harbor to Wailuku and reassembled by the faithful members of the parish. These are considered one of the greatest art treasures in the islands. In the late 1900s, the parishioners discovered that the weather and termites had conspired to bring their church to near ruin. They raised over $1 million, largely through the sale of bread, to bring it back. It was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1983. It is the only octagonal-shaped building in Hawaii from the 19th century. It's also significant for its close association with the Portuguese community on Maui. This is St. John's Church, which is in Kula. The Reverend Shim Yin Chin came to Maui's upcountry in 1900 to minister to Chinese farmers and their families. He had been trained as a Lutheran minister in China, but came to Hawaii under the auspices of the Anglican Church. This mission church was built in 1907 and still serves the congregation every Sunday. Materials to build the church arrived at McKenna Landing on the seacoast about 3,000 feet directly below the church site. The materials were delivered by horse-drawn wagons. The single-wall carpenter Gothic-style wood structure has a bell tower and 3-sided porch with a door that is always open. Father Shin also uses the church as a school for boys and a World Knowledge Society that kept adults abreast of current events. This is the Makawao Union Church. This church was designed in the English Gothic style by noted architect C.W. Dickey and opened in 1917. Is also known as the Baldwin Memorial Church because the land for the church was donated by Henry P. Baldwin, a wealthy Maui planter who was a longtime parishioner and supporter. The church was erected atop the foundation of the old Paliuli sugar mill, which had been closed in 1880. This church is also on the National Register of Historic Places. So I'd like to discuss with you 2 projects that my office has been working on to repair and restore for 2 churches on Maui. Both of these buildings are on the National Register of Historic Places, so the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation had to be followed. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions established a mission at this site at Wananalua in Hana in 1838. The first residents were Daniel Toll Conde and his wife Andalucia. They were the first missionaries to permanently settle in Hana. At that time, there were approximately 6,000 Hawaiians living in the area. The existing Wananalua Church building was constructed in 1842. Stone for the church was gathered from the ruins of a heiau, and the original roof was thatched. The framing timbers came from the mountains, and coral was gathered from the ocean. The coral was burned for lime and used to make mortar. This wood bell tower was added later in 1897. In the latter decades of the 19th century, when the Hana sugar plantation was active, hundreds of people attended services in this church, and latecomers had to stand in the back of the church or outside to participate. Hana's population declined sharply after 1930, but Wananalua has never closed its doors. The church is typical of the churches of this period in that it was constructed of local materials by Hawaiians under the supervision of a missionary and was built to serve the Hawaiian community. It is one of approximately a dozen remaining stone churches which were built on Maui in the mid-19th century, although many of these have fallen into ruin or disrepair. This church has been in continuous use since its construction and is one of the best remaining examples of stone churches on Maui, and it's noteworthy for its size. This church and the Hana courthouse are the only two surviving structures from the 19th century left in Hana, and it was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1988. So the building is rectangular in plan with stone exterior walls, which are about 2 feet thick. Inside is the nave area, an office and vestry, and a meeting room with a counter and sink. At the north or front end is a nave, is an outset square bell tower addition, which serves as the main entry into the church. Arched wood doors and arched wood windows are along the nave. The windows, as you can see in the photo on the right, have these metal sash stays where you actually push it out and then you put it into place on a peg to hold it open. These are pretty neat. So the tower, which was added later, it was about 50 years after the church was first constructed, has had some minor structural improvements on the inside, but otherwise is in good condition. So we performed a survey to identify issues within the church building and the adjacent parish hall, and we're currently beginning the process to complete construction drawings. We learned that the foundation is a wood structure on lava rock, and it's built separately from the walls. It's actually the exterior rock walls are built in a rectangular form, and then the wood floor is built inside and goes right up to meet the exterior walls, but it really isn't connected to it. And so along the side that you can see in the picture on the right, it's actually starting to sink. And this is possibly due to damage to the foundation, could also be something going on in the ground underneath, but the crawl space underneath is too small to really access and view the damage or to conduct repairs. And so in order to fix this, we're going to need to remove the flooring and repair it from above and then reinstall flooring. Many of the windows have damage, especially at the lower portions, the bottom part of the casing, the bottom part of the sash, and then especially the wood sills. This is both due to weather damage and also due to termite damage. There's some drainage issues that were happening from the tower roof, and they're currently diverting the water through the tower using hoses and pipes. You can see that in the middle of the picture here. Also in this picture, you can see where the sunlight's coming through the roof from missing roofing. It's allowing the water to get inside the tower also. Also, the wood shake roofing is quite deteriorated, and there's some missing, allowing water to get inside. And there's also clearly issues of water infiltration and damage at the tower roof. The other church that we've been working on is Kaʻahumanu Church in Wailuku. This church was established in 1832 on the site of a heiau and is part of the royal compound of High Chief Kahekili. In 1832, Queen Kaʻahumanu, who was an early convert to Christianity, visited Maui and witnessed services conducted by Jonathan Smith Green at this newly established church. And impressed by what she saw, she requested that the Congregationalist mission name the permanent church structure after her once it was completed. Initially, Reverend Jonathan Smith Green conducted services in a modded shed. As the congregation swelled from 7 to 3,000 in just 2 years, a second thatch structure was erected in 1834. Despite the size of the congregations, the permanent membership remained relatively small, with only 11 members noted in an 1835 report. During the Great Revival between 1837 and 1840, church membership skyrocketed to 487, with 200 new members joining in the 1838 to 39 period alone. To accommodate the surge, a third church structure was constructed under the supervision of Reverend Richard Armstrong in 1840. This two-story stone church, measuring 100 feet by 52 feet, became the centerpiece of the congregation. So the current church structure, which was the fourth on the site, was completed in 1876 and named to honor Kaʻahumanu as she requested. The building was constructed in the New England simple Gothic style, which was overseen by Edward Bailey, who was the manager of the Wailuku Sugar Company. The building has mortared and plastered stone exterior walls and a wood roof structure and steeple with both a bell and a clock face on 3 sides. The church's bell and clock were sourced from the Seth Thomas Clockworks, which were brought over in 1884. The clock within the Kaʻahumanu Church was designated the town clock by Maui County officials. And so this was kind of a fun story. I told a friend of mine in Wailuku that I was going to be working on this church. And she said, oh, my friend's husband actually maintains this clock. And so I got to chatting with him, and he told me that he had moved to Wailuku 35 years ago, and he saw that the clock was typically wrong. They say that a stop clock is right twice a day, but I think that it was still working. It was just always incorrect. So he learned about the importance of the church and the fact that at the time it was built, that people typically didn't have watches or clocks, and they used this clock and the chimes to know what time it was. So he immediately went in and told the church that he would fix the clock and he would maintain it, but he didn't know how. So he contacted clock specialists on the East Coast to learn how, and learned how to do this. And so now he maintains it weekly. The church has buttressed stone walls. It has a wood entry porch with concrete stairs, and it has arched wood windows in the nave. The interior has a wood ceiling under the heavy timber trusses and a choir loft at the back, and also a stair to the steeple. The chandeliers were added in 1892 to illuminate the church interior. The building was added to the Historic Register in 1975, and then the Hawaii State Register in 1981. So the issues that we found with this church was there's many areas where there was cracked plaster, particularly around the base of the windows and also at the buttresses. And this is allowing water infiltration into the plaster, and it's exacerbating the crack damage and the issues with the plaster. And clearly there was also areas of deteriorated and peeling paint. The windows typically have damage at the lower sash, the window sills, and the bottom of the exterior casing. They're also missing putty, which could allow that the glass panes to pop out. And it was also missing windows at the clock tower. Some of the largest problems, though, are the roof and the steeple damage. There's deteriorated wood shake roofing, which was installed on horizontal battens, which typical of the period, but it has no waterproofing underneath it. Also, there's no sheathing that provides structural diaphragm to assist in the structural integrity. So the steeple is super tall, which makes it difficult to repair this. We used a drone to look very closely at the different parts of the steeple that had issues. A lot of it was the wood trim. There was the wood louvers. The shingle roofing that's on there is also damaged. So there was clearly a lot of repairs that are needed here. Also, we saw there was inappropriate use of plywood in a previous repair. So many of these historic buildings and sites are listed on the state and national historic registers, but they're also actively used with congregations that maintain them as centers of community and tradition. They're still the gathering place for baptisms, weddings, funerals, and social interaction. But sometimes the towns that they have served for decades and even centuries have dwindled in size and are even totally gone due to changes such as people moving away as their sources of income change, plantations close, and economies change. In some places, the church remains as the lone icon of what was once a thriving community. Their small membership has difficulty in raising funds to repair these significant buildings that are representative of the history of the state, the island, and the communities. If they're on the historic register, they can more easily apply for grants, which has helped some of these historic buildings. So I hope that communities continue to find ways to preserve these meaningful structures that are reminders of both our architectural and our cultural histories. So just wanted to see if anybody has any questions.
I haven't seen any yet in the chat. Usually there's quite a few comments and questions in the chat. So while people are maybe thinking of what they might want to ask, I have a few things. But first of all, thank you, and a really informative talk. It was very, very interesting, and just the overall background and to understand these things. I think a lot of people think that the churches, the missionaries came, they brought other missionaries from Tahiti, they started the churches, and it was just easy going. And you reminded us that there was a period, there was an initial excitement, and then it fell off quite a lot until the late 1830s, where there was a major revival. So I'm beginning to see some questions. We have a question of, are all of these churches on the national or state registers?
Actually, just some of them. Both churches that we're working are on the historic registers. I think there was one of the later ones, the one that was designed by Charles Dickey, is on the register, and a few of the other ones. So it's kind of a mix. Maybe, I think maybe half of the ones that I showed are on the register.
She was
And
at
I think
one.
I think that really can help them to, clearly it's a statement of the significance of the building and that people of the community find it important, but it also allows them to apply for federal grants and things.
Shania asked if the Makawao Union Church was on the, she believes it is on the National Register of Historic Places, so that's interesting. Somebody asked about temples, and Andrea, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we ended up saving temples for another time. But we, Lorraine Minotoishi has done a lot of work on Buddhist temples, and we will ensure that we get something on temples at some point. But I think we had some scheduling difficulties, so thanks. So let me ask a couple of questions while we wait for more. So roofing materials, I love wood roofs. I think they're just terrific, but they are getting more and more expensive to put on. They last a long time if they're correctly maintained. Are you beginning, or other people in the field beginning to think about substitute materials? And if so, what are these?
Yeah, so there's lots of considerations. Some is cost. And I think with buildings like this, when we're trying to apply to the Secretary of Interior standards, we're trying to use what we think is the original material. So for a lot of these, that would have been wood shingles. People also now, though, are getting concerned about fire safety and looking at trying to use materials that are maybe less flammable. So I think some do try to use more of like an asphalt shingle, but there's the kinds that actually look a little bit more like wood shingles. I think there is a little bit more leniency now into considering using other materials as long as it looks as much as possible like the original material. You wouldn't want to go with something that was, completely different than maybe the original roof material. Another consideration too is that most of these churches that had wood shakes or wood shingles as the original roofing were using horizontal battens. And I found some of these churches, they are just attaching the shingles directly to the batten, and there's no waterproofing underneath. There's no ability for it to provide any structural stability. So especially when you're in a church where you can't see the roof from underneath, like say there's the ceiling, we've been going back and putting in using plywood and better waterproofing to just try to help protect the historic church, even though it wouldn't have originally had that.
Many people who have been to Colonial Williamsburg may realize that the roofs there actually are a cementous asbestos reinforced material that they invented in the 20s. And I had a friend who was the conservator there, and they people liked them, and occasionally when they changed them, they were disappointed by real wood roofs because they didn't carry moss and things the way these more picturesque asbestos roofs did. But of course now we can't use asbestos in manufacturing, so it is
Right.
interesting. A lot of tile roofs can actually look like wood roofs, but then they're quite heavy.
Yeah.
They make tiles that will work. Now we
Yeah, and
have
that's
some
so
good questions.
sometimes
Go
I
ahead.
say sometimes you have to then look at whether the roof structure can support that, because that's not how it was originally built to support that heavy weight.
Many of you are familiar and Oahu residents of the Church of the Crossroads, and I think they did a recent installation twice. I think the first time they had too much exposure on their wood because much of it would be hidden, and then it cupped and distorted, and I think they redid it with the proper amount of small. I think it's like about a quarter of it gets exposed in a proper installation. So it's quite interesting problems, but they do last a long time if you take care of them. So Wendy Wickman, good to see you, Wendy, or not see you, yeah, in chat. Um, Asked about how do you repair sills?
Well, it depends on how badly damaged it is. If it seems like it's um, still somewhat intact but has some damage, you can use putty and other things to sort of patch the area that has, especially if it's termite damage. If it's really lost all of its sort of supportive integrity, then you're going to have to pull the piece out. If it's possible, you can just patch a portion of it. Um, it's not a simple process if you're trying to replace the whole sill, but so we try to avoid doing that. And I try to patch it instead if that's possible, because there are good products now that can help you to hold it together, epoxy type materials or putty.
And Glenn taught us all the word Dutchman, and those can be used occasionally for partial repairs. If any of you want to explore this further, there's Missy Diericks, many years ago wrote a piece in the Association for Preservation Technology Journal, and she made an argument that it's more honest to replace them in kind than to do the kind of repairs that Katie did suggesting. And I've done both, so it can be done, but you do often have to disassemble the rest. It's very hard to get a sill in there sometimes because it's joined in with the other part of the casing. But I had great luck with epoxy hardener and epoxy and paint. It works very well. But you got to solve some of the problem ahead of time. Let's
I
see,
think
Linda LeGrand.
Historic Hawaii Foundation also has a wood repair, a wood window repair workshop that might go into some of that as well.
Yeah, a good suggestion. It's kind of fun doing window repairs. So if any of you have never done it, doing the putty and all that, it's quite fun. Linda LeGrand had a question about artisans. Is it hard to find people to do this kind of work?
Actually, it is, especially when we're talking about plaster and some of the very detailed wood repairs, because when we replace a window sash or repair it, we're really trying to keep all of the dimensions and elements the same, and people really aren't building windows like that anymore. So it is often hard to find craftsmen who will do this and take the attention. And I found trying to repair some windows at historic building, they had taken the sashes out to do it and wanted to take off the paint. And so they were using a wire brush and absolutely scrubbing the muntins and mullions to get the paint off, which was completely shredding any detail that was left there. And so sometimes you have to just sort of make sure first that the person understands how delicate something might be.
We had a question from Yusen Ewart. Excuse me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but he was asking about financial support, and Andrea's been answering you some in the chat. But there is an organization called Partners for Sacred Places, I believe. I think it was founded back in Philadelphia back in the early 1980s. And they're a kind of clearinghouse for information on all sorts of things about churches, both case studies and lots of things. Katie, you have any other thing to suggest on the funding part?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you're going to be able to raise $1 million by bread sales anymore, but there are sometimes churches have to pull together from a source a number of sources, and so maybe they could get preservation grants through a local organization, if it's on the historic register, maybe through national organizations, and then the community just doing different types of fundraisers. So often it takes kind of a group effort.
Someone, Boyd was asking about what we would call federal funds. There have been sort of initiatives. In the old days, the National Park Service administered a program called the Acquisition and Development Program, and they actually did provide hard money for doing projects. That kind of dried up long before, actually back in the Reagan administration, but other initiatives have taken place. There's the sort of certain Preserve America grants from time to time have been put out. Be curious. I sort of suspect there won't be a lot of grants in the next few years. I imagine anything in the way of grants will not be coming from the federal government unless something changes. That would be specifically the kind of grants that would be National Park Service. They have both sort of an internal part of the Park Service where they work on their own buildings, their own properties, and then they have another one where they reached out to in fact, they partially fund the state office as well.
Can I just add, I've been putting links in the chat related to some of the funds available through Historic Hawai Foundation in partnership. And also, what we have found is that people who want to raise funds are often, as Katie mentioned, a community, and they start off often not knowing exactly how they're going to do that and going step by step. What does seem to happen is taking advantage of pieces of funding through these grants, if you're eligible, and you can read more about that online, kind of becomes a real catalyst and impetus for other money to join it as the project takes on momentum. So I just wanted to say, if you know are involved in communities that are trying to protect churches or sacred sites, to not give up, but to kind of start that process and get a core group of people, because you do need to have a small group of people. There's a lot to be done, but you can learn a lot and you can do it. Okay, just wanted to show that.
So Kirsten Downey was asking initially, how does someone like, particularly you, Katie, how do you get paid at first to do these analyses?
Well, actually, for the Kaʻahumanu Church, our office donated our labor for that because we just felt like it was really important that repairs to the church needed to happen. They will need to raise money for construction, but sometimes they will ask companies to sort of give them the best price possible and donate some of the labor, and sometimes they are willing to do that. So it depends on the financial the financial setting of the church and what they're able to come up with. And I think they understand, there's steps along they need to pay money for the architectural team to look at the building, and then also for the construction, the materials. And some of these churches are really in quite remote locations. Wananalua Church is in Hana, and so getting materials out there is going to be difficult and more expensive. Trying to get a contractor who's willing to come, spend time in Hana, because just driving there from Kahului takes a couple hours, and probably not all materials can make it down that windy road. So yeah, some of these churches have an even harder time than others, and getting people to work on it and get the materials there.
I think Katie identified one of the, a lot of these churches were built at a time when the rural population was in different places and situated in different areas. And as those rural populations move away, then the congregation drops in numbers as well. And oftentimes even urban churches lose their congregations because they don't have the same number of participants or congregants as they used to have. And unfortunately, a lot of the newer churches don't seem to want to take on old churches. They want to have their own new church. So I've always thought they should broker that in a way so that you could move a newer, more active church into an older church. It's common not only in Hawaii, but places like the American South or the Virgin Islands where I worked before, very much a problem. You got great, wonderful old churches with small congregations, and then new churches that sometimes they do nice new buildings, but quite often they're more like warehouse buildings or butler buildings, at least at the beginning.
Sometimes now you find historic churches which are being sold off and used as other buildings. So somebody might turn it into a house or some kind of a community hall or adaptive reuse.
Right. Happens in England as well. They have a lot of the nonconformist chapels which are not maintained by the government, as the Episcopal or Anglican churches are official government property in a way. They're maintained, but the other ones, you quite often will see ads for nonconformist chapel for sale.
Be an interesting building to live in.
I had a friend who worked for the State Department. He was a historical architect like yourself, and he, Kevin Saring was his name, and unfortunately died several years ago, quite young for modern times. But anyway, he had he bought a small chapel. He called it the Apple Chapel, and he set up his living area behind the altar area where there was a room for him to put his bed and his kitchenette and things, and he left the rest of it open, and he would do community activities there. It was very nice. It was in, like I said, West Virginia, and he would have an annual fall fair and things like that. It was a really nice use of the building. Let's see, Andrea, are we coming up with any other questions here?
Not seeing other questions in the chat. Katie, is there anything that you weren't able to share with us about these churches? I especially think our audience, and I know I appreciated so much the context and history that provided the significance of them to the communities. Any personal stories of being on the sites or feedback from communities about the work that you're doing, maybe? And I love the clock story. It was super cool.
Yeah, I did see somebody wrote that they had attended a service at Kaʻahumanu Church and the work is desperately needed, which is true. And that church, we did the investigation and drawings quite a while ago, and it takes a while, of course, when it's on the historic register and it's also within a historic district. So the permitting takes a while. It has to go through the planning department. It has to go through the Cultural Resources Commission of Maui County, has to go through the State Historic Preservation Division. And so that took a while, but then it's also taking a while for the church to get the funds. Because the steeple is so high, they're going to have to use scaffolding for someone to get up there. I think if somebody tried to use a cherry picker, the wind would blow and they probably would get really sick and nauseous up there. So they've been talking with someone who specializes in putting up scaffolding, because that's actually going to be one of the major costs for it, to put up the scaffolding. So they've been trying to work with a contractor and someone who can do the scaffolding to sort of get going on this and get their work done. Because yeah, every winter we go through and it's raining a lot, we all just sort of, put our hands over our face and just, hope that the water damage there doesn't get too much worse. And I've seen that that's a real common problem in some of these older churches, is just issues with the roof and water infiltration, because that just continues to get in and continues to cause more problems, and it's hard for them to continually maintain it, but then come up with the funding to repair it. So yeah, but they're really special places, and when I started to look at how many there were, it was really neat. But I'm sure a lot of people have had some of their own experiences going there, either growing up in one of these areas or just kind of going over as a tourist and visiting some of these places. Yeah, I did love the story about the guy who went up and decided to maintain the clock, and how he didn't know how to do that, but he's like, I'm going to learn because I think that's important. And it's still the same clock, and that all the mechanism that's in there, and he goes in and oils it and learns how to adjust it and stuff so that it keeps working.
So I was going to have a question about damage due to earthquakes and whether you've encountered that. And now return to Kirsten Faulkner, had a longer question about basically about code compliance, but I'm thinking more about the structural questions of that. As you know, that there was a famous church, as I believe, in North Kahala that completely
Yeah.
collapsed in that earthquake.
Kaʻahumanu Church. Yeah.
Very sad. And these are mass masonry walls with no sorts of reinforcing, of course, and they depend on their sheer bulk and heaviness to keep them going. And if you have a major earthquake, they do end up shaking loose. It happens everywhere in the world, in Italy and places like that as well. So are
Yeah,
many
a
of
lot of
these
the
churches
older
that you were
churches
looking
are,
at were affected?
yeah, yeah, a lot of the older churches, of course, are stone and coral. And I think when they're built of blocks, maybe it's a little bit more stable, but a lot of them are built with lava rock, which is sort of more rounded, and they plaster it together. And that was the case at Kaʻahumanu Church. That earthquake, I think, was in 2006. And the walls there were about 16 feet high. And then it had this huge ohia timber truss roof structure on the top. And so good portions of the wall collapsed. Unfortunately, there was nobody in the church at the time, so nobody was injured. Um, but the roof just kind of slid down sideways. And so they were able to sort of jack up the roof and support it, and they reconstructed the walls. But they had to rebuild them to meet, modern code and to be safe. And so I believe they used a concrete block structure, but made the walls still like the 2 feet thick that they originally were. And using historic photographs, when they replastered the outside, they made sure to score it to look like it had before. And then they reused those stones somewhere else on the property for something else. So yeah, it was sad that they had to rebuild the walls, but of course it's much safer. So the earthquakes are, with the stone church is always a potential for damage. I think the wood structures tend to deal with it a little better and have a little bit more ability to move.
I'm going to return to Kirsten's broader question, but first I wanted to just ask a little bit about how, as I know and you know, a lot of what you're identifying as plaster is later kind of concrete parging. And I wonder if you could say something about that. But I wanted to answer Timothy Miller about how did they cut coral blocks underwater? And I kind of know that answer if you don't know, Katie, but do you know?
Go ahead, Bill. Yeah, go ahead. I
Okay.
mean, yeah.
They use both wire and saws, basically. It's very soft when you're harvesting it. And then I learned about this in the Virgin Islands where they had a lot of coral block, and there's actually quite a bit of documentation. They would send young boys out in boats, and I think they did the same thing in Hawaii, and they'd jump into the water, and a lot of the reefs weren't quite as deep as what you're saying. And then when they bring the blocks up on land, and then they could fashion them a little bit more with, they'd probably use an adze or an axe, and then they'd let it harden, and it hardens quite a lot. As it dries out, it hardens, but when it's first harvested, it's quite easy to work. So that's the answer to that question. But then I'll let you move on to the concrete.
Yeah, of course, a lot of these old churches, when they used the stone, they often took the coral and burned it and turned it into lime to use with the plaster and mortar. And that's also something when we're doing repairs, you have to consider that you try to come in with the concrete, I'm sorry, the cement plaster. They don't work well together. And so it's usually better if you can use a material that's more like what the original was if you're going to be patching. The cement plaster is stronger in a way, but it's also kind of more brittle. So in some ways, if certain like earthquake movement, it might break apart more and not have sort of, I guess coral plaster has a little bit more of a flexibility to it, but it's not as resistant to impact or rain and stuff. So I do remember working at Washington Place. The lower floor is coral blocks, which has been plastered on the outside, and originally it was plastered with the coral plaster, and somebody came along at some point and removed it all from like 4 feet down to the ground and came back with a cement plaster. And you can just see the difference if you stand there. There's a horizontal line in the building where the bottom is the cement plaster and the top is the lime plaster. But the cement plaster is probably better resistant to water. So that's why they wanted to put that on the lower part that was sometimes getting exposed to the rainwater.
I think it's almost always a mistake to use modern cement. When it hardens, it forms it's what's called hydroscopic, that traps the moisture, and it doesn't allow moisture to come out as traditional lime plasters do, allow the walls, in a sense, to breathe. And the trouble is, particularly if you have infiltrated salts, which you often have, the efflorescence, it will then deposit at the edges of your patches, and then that will cause further moisture and then cause further erosion and undermining the structure of the building. So original
So
materials
you're,
are important.
yeah, so you're fixing a problem, but you're causing other problems.
And now let's get back to Kirsten's bigger question. What about not only seismic? I mean, can you retrofit for better seismic compliance, or fire safety or accessibility? And if you do this, how does it affect the integrity, as we say in the business, of the original?
Yeah, a lot of times, especially I think looking at the roof structure, and now people are usually to provide more protection against wind uplift, and also to some of the seismic, they're trying to attach the roof structure to the wall and have it sort of, work together better. So um, often you can do this inside the attic where people are not seeing it because typically there is a ceiling, although not always. If you are adding some metal connections and things, you want to try to hide that so people don't see it. But that does help improve the situation. Some of the coral or stone walls don't really have a continuous beam along the top that the roof structure sits on, that you could tie the roof structure to the beam, then tie it to the wall. And so sometimes you have to be a little creative about figuring out how to attach a roof structure to the wall. But I think with a lot of the structures, as people are doing repairs, they are trying to go back and give the building a little bit more strength and ability to survive different events like that. Um, and so it's a balance. It's a balance of trying to protect the structure and protect the people, and also trying to protect the integrity of the building.
Am I correct in assuming that the buttresses for the Kaʻahumanu Church in Wailuku, do they really play a structural role, you think, or are they an aesthetic kind of addition? It's a kind of odd combination of Gothic and kind of more Georgian-like massing, and of course the tower has more of a Georgian feel to it than does the nave part of the building. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I hoped that it helps provide something. It does provide a visual interest, but I suppose it probably provides some assistance in keeping the wall straight and, trying to support it against any earthquakes and things. I mean, it's still there and still standing pretty straight.
Sometimes you'll see people have installed buttresses after the fact, and that's actually quite often a mistake because they settle at a different rate and then they lean out away from the building, and so you haven't really accomplished anything. So if churches were built with buttresses, ideally they're done at the same time as the building. Um, Someone was asking about when are these, are there work going on at both, is there work going on at both buildings now?
So the Kaʻahumanu Church, they've been working with the contractor and a construction administrator to get going on construction. So I think they're not quite signed a contract yet for it to happen, but they did get the building permit, so I think that's going to happen quite soon. Wananalua Church, we're still putting together the construction drawings, and it is in the SMA, the special management area, so we'll have to address that during the permitting as well. So sometimes that adds a little bit of time, but that one will probably be, maybe another year before construction happens, I think.
Well, and do you think we're reaching to the end of our time, I believe. So I want to thank Katie very much for a really interesting talk, and it went well beyond just understanding the technologies involved in fixing up older buildings or preserving them, but also what their broader social historical context is. So thanks so much, and it's great to see you again, and it's great to see everybody in the audience. And I'll let Andrea close down if you like.
Yes, thank you. I echo Bill's words, Katie. It was fascinating. I love the context and just I think what we're seeing in the thread of these series is just the challenge of doing this work with materials and aligning with um, the historical and architectural integrity of these sites. There can be challenges. So I think you addressed several of those today, and that was really helpful. Yeah, I want to thank everyone for joining us. It's great to have all these people interested in this series and these types of conversations. And I want to thank Michelle Kisik, my colleague, who's providing technical support in the back. And welcome everyone to join us next week. We will be doing February 19th, same time on Wednesday at noon. Tonya Moy will be presenting and exploring conserving architecture at Courts of the Missing, the Honolulu Memorial at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. So that's sure to be very interesting. If you're not signed up for our newsletter, please go ahead and do so if you'd like to stay up to date. And please remember to take the survey. That would be awesome. And thank you so much to everyone for all your questions and your engagement. We really appreciate that. And if you'd like to donate to support future programming like this, you can visit Join Me section on the HHF website. So Katie, fantastic job. Mahalo nui loa. And thank you, Bill. Wonderful moderation. And we'll see everyone next week. A hui ho.
Oh,
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
thanks again, Kate.